Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Welcome to Industry Insights, episode 58. I'm joined today by my good friend and colleague, Jeff Reichert. Good morning. How you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing great. I hope everyone is doing well out there. Good to hear from you, Dave.
Yeah, likewise. So today we're not going to talk about whether Gartner issued an update to their Magic Quadrant or whether the same vendor this year as last year will be at the top of the ability to execute. Instead, we're going to launch into part one of our two-part series this week and next week around ransomware. And Jeff and I are going to kind of take this from more of a business view, a higher level discussion, introduce a cybersecurity framework that you can use to approach your ransomware remediation best practices. But before we get too far, Jeff, we should remind people a couple of quick things. First off, we want to welcome Facebook as well as LinkedIn. This is our first time for our Monday session, simulcasting on both platforms. Second, just a little housekeeping. If you're watching us on LinkedIn, closed captioning is on by default. You can expand that, meaning look at that on a larger screen and turn off that option if you would like to. Other thing that we're doing that's kind of unique for us is we've got a poll. A poll is running right now, and we'll come back to that every now and then. But it's essentially a poll of what ransomware-related topic or capability would you like our colleague Edwin and myself to double click on next week? So be looking for that. And one last thing that we should get out of the way quickly, Jeff, is love to hear where people are tuning in from. We've got a global map, as you can see. Just drop a comment in there. I'm located in Colorado. We've got our producer in Georgia. You're in Connecticut, Jeff, and we've got some of our team that's over in Romania. So we appreciate all of that. Give a shout out from wherever you're tuning in from. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop that in line as well. So without further ado, Jeff, you've been spending a great deal of time on this topic. It's almost inescapable. Maybe take us through just a little bit about what's changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we have a slide with some of the evolutions in ransomware this year. It's kind of impossible to be in any business connected with technology, or really to be aware of the news and not have come across ransomware a lot lately. Sophos, the antivirus company, does a pretty well-regarded survey every year. They actually survey over 5,000 folks worldwide to ask what their experience has been with ransomware. And it's helpful to look at because there's some continuity. They've been doing this for a while. One of the interesting stats in this year's survey was that actually the number of respondents that Sophos talked to that had experienced a ransomware attack went down. Last year, the percentage was 37%. Last year it was 51%. This year, it's only 37%. That was pretty much the only positive evolution in ransomware, though. From 2020 to 2021, it was in the news a lot last year. One of the kind of chilling things that they've seen is that folks, even who pay a ransom, are not getting their data back. Folks that get all data back after they pay a ransom were only 8% of respondents. And you can see here, the average was just a little bit better than half, 65% of data recovered after paying a ransom, which obviously paying a ransom is a bad solution anyway, right? It's not something that anyone wants to have to do. But even doing it didn't solve the problem in most cases for people out there.
I think that's kind of amazing because this is sort of like pre 9/11 where, the thought process has changed, right? It used to be in a situation like this, you just comply, you roll along with it and everything will be okay. But literally 2/3 get the data back, 1/3 does not, is problematic. I saw another stat not too long ago, just a couple of weeks ago, that basically said if you've been attacked once, your probability within a 12-month period to get attacked a second time is quite high. So that is certainly concerning. The average cost, though, staggering. That's in United States dollars, but approaching $2 million. That's, as the old joke goes, that's approaching real money, isn't it, Jeff?
Right, exactly. And there's some reasons for that high price tag. You've probably read a lot of the news stories lately talking about sort of big game hunter ransomware gangs that are out there. The current attack that's going on with a $70 million initial declared ransom request was kind of amazing. And things like not just the ransom extortion, but double extortion, where data is exfiltrated and then the attackers, the adversaries, threaten to leak that data, which might include trade secrets, it might include personally identifiable information for an organization's customers or constituents, if it's a university, things like that. All that has made the demanded ransom go up. And we're even seeing triple extortion now, where if, for example, it's a healthcare facility or something like that, the ransomware actors are calling the actual folks whose data they've stolen. So the patients, contacting the patients themselves and saying, hey, we're going to leak your private medical information unless you pay us a ransom too. So all of this is making the whole threat environment, threat landscape look a lot worse. And what it's causing a lot of folks to do, maybe even smaller organizations that hadn't looked carefully at security, are now starting to look again at what they can do to secure their environment better.
Yeah, and I want to get to our cybersecurity framework discussion quickly, but I love this next slide because it is essentially purposely busy. So, and the title is perfect that you put on there, Jeff. Compliance can look complex. Well, it turns out it is complex. There's a lot of different parts to it, but maybe take us through this portion and then we'll take a look at the map.
Yeah, that sounds great. So this is actually a wonderful diagram. It's a U.S. federal government resource for the types of controls, the types of guidance that United States Department of Defense organizations need to look at, and the sets of controls that they need to be aware of to build a secure information network. It is actually a really good, helpful resource. But what I love about this is exactly what you just mentioned. I think a lot of folks, especially smaller organizations that may have looked earlier at how do I get secure? How do I put some kind of a compliance framework in place? Could look at something like this and probably have looked at spreadsheets with big daunting sets of controls and kind of thrown up their hands and figured, what on earth can we do about this? Or if they've not implemented something themselves, maybe they've had a consultant come in, get a good baseline of security, and then left it at that instead of revisiting it. One of the things that's really helpful about risk-based, outcome-based frameworks, instead of just big sets of controls like this, is that they let you, eat the apple one bite at a time. You can look at what your biggest risks are as an organization. You can look at where you're exposed, and you can go through a kind of iterative process and understand what's my exposure to cyber risk. You can communicate that up the chain, and you can get funding for it maybe more easily than if you take your senior leadership a giant spreadsheet of controls and say, here's all the stuff that we have to do.
Outstanding. So I'm hearing that we're getting an update on the map. I think we've got almost 18 countries now. If we take a quick look at that.
Yeah, look at this.
Always nice when some of the bigger countries, you see Mexico in this frame. We've also, from a state perspective in the U.S., have Ohio, Louisiana. In Europe, we've got Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Belarus, Austria, France. We've also got Turkey and Czech Republic. Don't want to leave them out. And then in South Africa, Brazil, Sri Lanka, Nepal, India. Let's see, anyone that I didn't mention? I think, I did mention Czech Republic. Good. So thank you all for tuning in. Really appreciate that. Let's take a look to see how our poll is running right now, and definitely encourage you to cast a vote if you haven't already. But the poll is just simply, what of 4 possibilities, 4 choices, would you like Edwin, Vaitima, and myself next week to double click on? Love to have you answer that, and we'll keep track of that. Perfect. So now, as we begin to kind of transition, Jeff, take us through NIST cybersecurity framework, a little bit about what it is, but also maybe about why it's applicable regardless of your geography, where you may be located.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the NIST cybersecurity framework was come up with by part of the United States federal government. The Department of Commerce has an organization called the National Institute of Standards and Technology that is responsible for lots of things. And one of them is creating cybersecurity framework and best practices. Now, the cybersecurity framework itself had its origin in an executive order back in 2013, and then it was further codified in law a year later. Version 1.1 of this, so the updated version, was released with some additional stuff around supply chain security back in 2018. We've got folks on today from all over the world. The reason that we're talking about the NIST cybersecurity framework, so again, this sort of work product that's constantly updated by the US government, is that it was designed from the beginning to be applicable not just for federal agencies here in the US, where it's mandatory, but also for critical infrastructure, private companies in the United States, things like the power grid, things like water supplies, other critical infrastructure. And it was also designed to be applicable around the world. And in fact, Edwin, who's going to be on next week, has confirmed that this is a big part of cybersecurity conversations that are happening in Europe and in other geographies as well. One of the cool things about the cybersecurity framework, and one of the reasons that our CISO here at Veeam, Gil Vega, has adopted and brought it into Veeam as sort of part of our best practices, is that, as I mentioned before, it is designed to be iterative, but it's also designed to help people in all parts of the organization communicate, sort of to give you a common language. It divides security up at the highest level into 5 broad functions. They're laid out here. Identify what your risks are, identify what actual assets you have, protect those assets, protect your information and your infrastructure. And then if anything bad happens to that, put structures in place to detect cyber events, cybersecurity events, and then respond and recover. Anyone can understand those 5 broad functions. And then they're broken down, obviously, at better levels of granularity into categories and subcategories under that. But one of the nice things about this is that it lets organizations, instead of focusing from the beginning on very, very granular sets of controls, like in that diagram that we looked at in the last slide, it lets organizations think about what their appetite for risk is, what their greatest exposure to risk is, what their budget to remediate any risks that they've got is, and go through, as I said before, a kind of iterative process of fixing that. The NIST website, which is linked to here, has a lot of success stories, and those include international organizations. There are success stories from the UK, from Canada, from Japan, and others, folks that have successfully implemented the cybersecurity framework, basically exactly like Veeam has. And I mentioned here on the bottom of this slide, it actually rests on some of the same specific granular controls that the US Department of Defense risk management framework uses. So there's a lot of commonality of the kind of controls that are mandated here, or that are put in place, the guidance that's put in place here across the federal government, and again, extending to private industry as well.
Yeah, and if we double click on the NIST cybersecurity framework, or CSF, we can align existing Veeam product capabilities to that. And we'll get into more of a deep dive on this from a product functionality perspective next week with Edwin. But I do kind of want to make the point, people can kind of scan around, if you're familiar with some of the Veeam capabilities here, what falls into each of the 5 categories. And I like to your point, Jeff, that this is a continuous cycle. It's like performance. You're never done trying to tune performance. There's always something to address. And unfortunately, with cyber threats, there is really a never-ending notion of holes to fill, ways to try to remediate issues and or reduce the damage if you can. But speaking of change, now, framework around insurance is changing. I mean, I've actually hosted a panel recently where there are professional negotiators on both sides, by the way, meaning the bad actors and the people that have been infiltrated and attacked. So it's a bit like a hostage negotiator. They are literally negotiating the payment. But things have changed over the years.
Yeah, very, very much so. So the segue here, I think that a lot of folks have noticed that some of the successful ransomware attacks that have gone on, cyber insurance companies have actually paid the ransoms. And Dave, to your point, they have security experts on staff that help their customers deal with this, deal with the ransom negotiations, deal with the cleanup and the forensics and all that kind of thing afterward. What's interesting about the insurance business, and we're in the tech business, we're not in the insurance business, but Dave and I are talking about this today for a reason, is that it's changed enormously in the face of the ongoing pressure from the ransomware epidemic that we're all living through right now. 10 years ago, there wasn't a real clear idea of what the risks in the insurance business were. And even as recently as May of 2018, Warren Buffett told the Berkshire Hathaway when they had their annual shareholder meeting that Berkshire Hathaway wasn't getting into this business because he didn't think anyone knew how to effectively quantify the risk around cyber insurance. 10 years ago, and even as recently as 5 years ago, folks were writing this kind of business for very low premiums. There wasn't a real good idea of what potential aggregated losses could be. In other words, suppose we have a really big ransomware attack, exactly like the one that we're seeing right now with the $70 million ransom demand. Suppose we have a really big ransomware attack that goes on, how much would the insurance industry stand to lose? And all of this has led to some pretty significant changes. And I think we've got a slide on that coming up here next, don't we, Mark? Yeah, there we go. So another U.S. government agency, the Government Accountability Office, actually commissioned a study beginning in January. It ran 4 months. It was published in May about the threat to the insurance industry worldwide from the ransomware epidemic that's going on right now. And what they found in surveying insurance companies, reinsurance companies, so the insurers to help distribute risk and manage any one company's exposure to risk, they found that demand for cyber insurance is going up enormously. Even 5 years ago, a lot less companies were thinking that they needed cyber insurance, and demand is going up hugely, and prices are going up enormously too. There's one anecdote about a very unfortunate small city in Canada that got hit with ransomware last fall. When they went to renew, they found that their premiums for cyber insurance had more than doubled because they got hit with ransomware. And so the market, as the report points out, is really rapidly hardening around this. And it's something, Dave, we've been hearing from our customers too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the threat of attacks are only increasing. As you pointed out, what people do with that data is changing. But even from a cyber insurance perspective, I'll call it sometimes referred to as digital hygiene. The bar is continually being raised in terms of how you have to prove that you're operating your business appropriately. I'm hearing we got an update on the map, including first ever viewers from Trinidad and Tobago and Congo. We've also
fantastic.
had some new areas come in, California, Atlanta, New Hampshire, but we've got Malaysia, Morocco as well. And someone asked a question, hey, are the slides available? We don't have a way to push them out on LinkedIn. So we always just suggest rewatch and grab a screenshot of something that might be of interest to you. I'll break out of our semi-scripted notion here just for a second, Jeff, and just give an advertisement that our colleagues, Rick Vanover and Edwin Weidema, they're coming out with a long-form paper really oriented towards SEs and deep dive administrators in terms of hardening systems and Veeam specifics. Jeff and I have just completed a more executive level, higher form paper. Each of these should be out probably within the next couple of weeks, early August at the latest. Also, Monterey has come in and Florida has come in as well. Want to give a shout out to our poll, though. Keep voting on that if you would, please. Which ransomware capability would you like us to spend additional time on next week as it relates to Veeam product functionality? So back to our regularly scheduled programming, Jeff. I've got an interesting slide that just talks through the broader context associated with this framework.
Yeah, this was a news story a couple of weeks ago, and Dave, I really liked it because as we talked about before, the NIST cybersecurity framework itself at this point, started back in 2014. It was the product of a government mandate and cooperation with industry and with academia, it's been very, very successful. And we've all seen the news about both the US government and G7, other governments in Europe, NATO. The response to ransomware is getting much more focused, and the kind of pronouncements that folks are making at the federal government level, not just in the United States, but all over the world. What I liked about this is that this is a really good example, and Connecticut's not the only state that's done this. Here in the United States, Ohio and Utah have also taken the same step of a state legislature saying, we know we have a problem with private companies not maybe following the best security practices that they could. Maybe they've done like we talked about before and sort of looked at this and gone through it once, or they've looked at it and said, this is too complex, I don't know where to start. And so the government in Connecticut, the legislature passed and the governor signed it into law a couple of weeks ago, said, let's figure out, instead of a stick, let's figure out a carrot that we can offer to businesses, an incentive for businesses to improve their digital hygiene, exactly as you mentioned earlier, Dave. And they said, if you follow a recognized cybersecurity framework, and the NIST cybersecurity framework is the first one listed in the Connecticut statute and the law, if you do that and you can prove that you do that, then we're going to give you safe harbor, the ability not to be sued for punitive damages should you have a ransomware attack or some kind of a cybersecurity breach. So in state court in Connecticut, you can't be sued for punitive damages if you can show that you've made a competent, good faith effort to follow this law. What's cool about this is that it lets probably a lot of you that are listening to this talk today who may be more on the technical side, it gives you a really good reason to go and talk with senior leadership, executive leadership, with your chief counsel, with your compliance and risk folks, and say, look, there is a direct payoff that we get back if we invest in better cybersecurity. And so I really liked the approach that's taken in Connecticut, and I think we're going to see more of this happening, not just here in the United States, but worldwide as time goes on.
Yeah, and I liked your point kind of at the outset there, where unfortunately, but in some regards, I think appropriately, world government leaders are taking cyber threats very, very seriously. Certainly, we've seen a lot of rhetoric around that probably in roughly last month at various summits and in certain statements. But more optimistically, I like your point too. We've got a slide on how you can leverage this to be proactive, to drive the budget discussion in a different direction. And, you know, Jeff, unfortunately, it's like disaster recovery. When I was an industry analyst, I would see trends spike, after a weather event or something happened in one region, all of a sudden interest in disaster recovery rose. And then after a period of time, it subsided. Unfortunately, this doesn't feel like something that's going to have a lot of ebb and flow associated with it, meaning we're not going to see a lot of, quiet time. But your point here about driving budget discussion, maybe take us through that, because I think it's nice to be proactive.
Yes, exactly. So if you work for a public sector organization, if you work for a government agency, or if you're in a highly regulated industry already, if you're in the pharmaceutical industry or financial services or lots of other industries that are highly regulated, for a long time, you've budgeted around cyber controls because you had to. You have to please the regulators in order to stay in business. What's happening with cyber insurance and with laws like the one in Connecticut is that at this point, a good security framework is no longer a nice to have. A good security framework is something that that organizations are being asked to demonstrate in order to even get cyber insurance. And if they can't demonstrate that they have very good digital hygiene, that they've got a mature security practice in place, they can find themselves paying much, much higher rates. We've heard from customers both in the United States and in the UK of rate differences from 10 to 40% based on being able to show that they've got one of the options in the poll that's out there, immutable backups. That is backups that even if an adversary tries to delete them, they can't. The backups are safe. What's cool about this is that for the first time, even if you're not in a highly regulated industry, you're in a position where you can go to your executive leadership, to your chief financial officer, to whoever makes the budget decisions in your organization and say, we're going to spend more money this year anyway. We're either going to spend it on insurance premiums because they're going up everywhere across the board for cyber insurance, or we're going to spend it actually protecting our data better than we do now. And it's a nice position. I mean, it's not nice that folks are going to have to be spending more money, but it kind of looks like they are in this particular area. But it's nice to be able to drive this to an outcome like better protection from your data and safety from ransomware. And that's really where the financial pressures of this whole threat are driving things right now. And it's a good conversation to be able to have proactively with your executive leadership, with your CFO, before your insurance comes up for renewal and you get a nasty surprise.
Yeah, and I just want to double click on this one really quickly because, we used to hear from administrators that would say, I have a hard time getting anyone to take backup modernization seriously, or if I come forward with the 10 things I want to do to modernize our backup infrastructure and our best practices, I get 3 of them, and I barely get, what my wish list was. Here's a situation, though, where literally you've got CEO visibility, you've got board level visibility as well. So do encourage people, seize the opportunity to do some of the things you've probably been wanting to do for some time now that will also have the added benefit of put you into a more secure posture. Really quickly, as we begin to wind down, I want to go back to the map. I think we're at 25 countries now. United Kingdom overall came in. We've got now first-time countries from a couple of different places, meaning first-time viewership. Encourage you, if you're doing video on demand, meaning watching later, keep weighing in and keep voting on the poll. I do believe that you're right, Jeff, that the Immutable Backup Repository is leading the poll, but definitely want to hear from everyone and want to give a shout out coming up this Friday. We're going to have Sam Nichols and David Hill discussing how Veeam can help you lower your AWS protection bill, save you big on that. We have some unique capabilities that they'll double click on. And then 1 week from today, our colleague Edwin Weidema is going to be going through, no doubt, Immutable Backup Repository. And actually, I chatted with Edwin this morning, my time, and he has some interesting topics and drill down on immutability overall, but the Veeam capability in particular. And we'll hit a number of other things as well. So want to thank everyone for tuning in. Want to thank Jeff for taking us through a lot of this great information. And want to just give a shout out to everyone. Stay safe, stay positive, and look forward to seeing you on an upcoming live stream. Bye for now.
Absolutely. Thanks all.